Welcome to POTUS 2017, where we keep watch on the Oval Office and pour cold hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Today we discuss the U.S. investigation into Russia's potential meddling in the 2016 presidential election as seen through the lens of a prominent investigator of Watergate. Later on in the show, we'll take a look at the effect automation is having on jobs. A new study finds it's much more than bad trade deals, which get more political heat. First up, the president, under the microscope, then and now. In 1974, U.S. Congressmember from Brooklyn, Elizabeth Holtzman, served on the House Judiciary Committee that voted to impeach Richard Nixon. Ms. Holtzman was also the author of special prosecutor legislation, later passed in response to the Watergate affair. She joins us now to discuss some similarities and differences between Watergate and the current investigation. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Brian. Glad to be here.
So one of the eerie parallels with Watergate is that Nixon fired the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, in the famous, what they called the Saturday Night Massacre. And we hear that Trump is setting up to possibly try to fire Robert Mueller. Why did Nixon think he could get away with it?
Well, Nixon knew that if the special prosecutor got what he was after, which was Oval Office tapes of Nixon's conversations, that would spell the end of Nixon, because those tape recordings would prove or disprove whether Nixon had participated in the cover-up. Ultimately, they proved that he participated in the cover-up, not just participated, orchestrated the cover-up. Nixon knew that those tapes were dynamite. The special prosecutor was trying to obtain them, had subpoenaed them, was seeking them, and he said, I can't tolerate this. I'm going to be out of the presidency if he gets those tapes. So he fired, well, he didn't directly fire Cox. He ordered the Attorney General to fire Cox. The Attorney General refused, then asked the Deputy Attorney General to fire Cox. The deputy refused. Both of them resigned rather than fire Cox, and then the number 3 person, Robert Bork, fired Cox.
Robert Bork, a footnote of history, for having been turned down for a Supreme Court justice position after being nominated by Ronald Reagan because he was seen as too radical. And he's the one who actually agreed to fire the special prosecutor on behalf of Richard Nixon.
It would have been a scandal, in a way, for the person who removed the special prosecutor to be sitting on the Supreme Court, so I'm glad he never made it.
How much did that incident and the political backlash from that incident have to do with the ultimate resignation of Nixon?
Well, up to that point of the firing of the special prosecutor, there had been first a Senate Watergate hearing, and the question there was, what does the president know and when did he know it? And that set of questions started to produce a lot of negative information about Nixon. For example, one of his top aides, John Dean, said, I told the president there was a cancer on the presidency. I told the president that bribes were being paid to the people who broke into the Watergate complex and Democratic National Committee headquarters. I told the president that pardons were being issued. And instead of saying, oh, this is terrible, let's end this, the president said, I know how we can get the money to pay off the burglars. That's the kind of information that had come out, and more. Also information about a tape recording system. What happened was that the leadership of the House of Representatives did not want to move on the question of impeachment. Nothing happened on impeachment until the Saturday Night Massacre. At that point, it wasn't the members of Congress who made the decision. It was the American people who were outraged that a president could fire a prosecutor who was investigating people around him and possibly even himself. American people said, we're not a banana republic. And Congress, you have to hold the president accountable. You have to take action. So that's what happened.
Did Nixon stoke the support of his base in the way that Trump seems to be doing by calling it a witch hunt and everything?
Oh, well, Nixon attacked it constantly. He said there's nothing there. He said his aides were, honest. He blamed it on John Dean, his lawyer. He was supposed to write a report. He never wrote a report, that kind of thing. So, of course, he was trying to manipulate the facts. He was also trying to manipulate the prosecutors. I mean, we see parallels not just in the firing of Archibald Cox, but we see parallels in the effort to manipulate the prosecutor. I mean, here we have President Trump calling the Russia investigation a hoax, the worst witch hunt in America, a horror, basically claiming that the prosecutor himself is engaged in illegal and in unethical things. A prosecutor can't engage in a witch hunt, can't engage in a false investigation, can't do that kind of thing. So he's accusing him on the one hand, and then we just recently learned that he actually was sending friendly messages to the prosecutor, and that happened. Nixon did that during Watergate. He sat down with the top prosecutor of the Department of Justice and beguiled him, charmed him, got the top prosecutor to give him all the information about what was going on in the investigation. And then Nixon turned around and told his aides, this is what they're looking for. So that was part of the articles of impeachment. So Donald Trump is taking a page out of Watergate, and he really needs to remember, if he follows in Nixon's footsteps, what's going to happen to him.
So if Trump really did this as reported, that is, sent a friendly note to Robert Mueller behind the scenes, like, oh, you're doing a great job, while calling it a witch hunt publicly, are you suggesting, based on the history of Nixon, that he may be putting himself in criminal liability by doing that, not just doing something inappropriate?
Yeah, I think it might be an abuse of the power of his office, and it may also be an obstruction of justice, an effort to try to intimidate the prosecutor, the attacks on Mueller, an effort to try to intimidate the prosecutor, and an effort to get his base to call members of Congress to try to cut off the investigation, to attack the investigation, to undermine it, and then at the stroking, what I would call the stroking conversations, also suggests that he wants to try to influence the outcome of this. So I think who's ever advising him is not giving him good advice. Trump needs to stay away from the prosecutor, but he's incapable of doing that.
He may be advising himself, ultimately. And there seems to be a pattern of this, because he also made contacts with Comey early on, when Comey was FBI director, and with the U.S. Attorney from New York, Preet Bharara, that led both Comey and Bharara to alert their colleagues and say, wait, I can't be getting these calls, these sort of political calls from the president. Yeah,
well, one of the things that Robert Mueller is investigating is whether the firing of Comey was an obstruction of justice, in other words, a federal crime. Remember, he first invited Comey to the White House for a private dinner. I mean, very few people get invited to have a private dinner with the president. Why is the FBI director being called to a private dinner? Because the conversation is about being loyal to him. Then there are future conversations about dropping the investigation into Flynn, which had to do with, again, the influence of the Russians and the meddling of the Russians in the U.S. election. So he has a pattern of attacking the prosecutor, trying to obstruct investigations, and he's using a variety of techniques.
Trump has suggested
I'm going to say that none of them will work, because I think that Mueller is a very professional and very experienced prosecutor, and he's assembled a top-notch team, and they're going to try to root out the truth.
What about the attempt to attack the team on the basis that some of them were contributors to Clinton or other Democrats? It can look unseemly if a prosecutor who's supposed to be politically independent is making political contributions to anyone.
Yes, but you don't know the basis of the political contributions. Maybe it was your best friend who said, listen, can you do me a favor and give this contribution, and so forth and so on. So you don't know whether this is an ideological or any other kind of affiliation or sentimental affiliation. But the point beyond that is that these are flimsy and concocted charges designed to try to intimidate Mueller and the investigation. The Department of Justice has already determined that these quote-unquote conflicts of interest are not valid claims. This is Trump's Department of Justice, so let's get past this. I think the point to understand is that he's throwing up he's the one who's throwing up the fake arguments. He's the one who's trying to obstruct the investigation.
Are you surprised that Jeff Sessions, given how political he tends to be, did recuse himself, allowing for Mueller to be appointed?
Well, I think that Sessions really had no choice about recusing himself. As he himself said, he's the Attorney General. He's told by the professional civil servant employees at the Justice Department that he's obliged under Justice Department rules to recuse himself. He wants to stay on as Attorney General. So I'm not sure that he necessarily envisioned that this was going to lead to the appointment of Mueller, but he did the right thing then.
Another development this week, it's reported that the FBI raided a home belonging to former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort. What do you think they're looking for there? And Manafort had said publicly that he was cooperating, so does this indicate that maybe he wasn't as much as he was trying to lead us all to believe?
Well, he might have been, but maybe the FBI was interested in more information than he had given them. Also, he said he had been cooperating with the Senate, not necessarily the same thing as the FBI. Huh. And the other thing that's really important here is that Manafort was a campaign manager. He had vast connections with the pro-Russian Ukrainian organizations. He was involved. He himself has admitted that he didn't do the proper filings that were required under the federal law, so he may be facing criminal liability. He also has had a very close connection with Roger Stone, another one of Trump's campaign advisors. And Roger Stone, as we know, was in touch with Russian hackers during the time that we're talking about in terms of meddling with the U.S. election. So Manafort,
and funny enough, was close to Nixon.
I think he has a tattoo related to Nixon on his back. But the point is that these people have a lot to say, could know a lot about meddling, and especially Mr. Manafort may be in a situation where he will have to cooperate with the feds, otherwise face criminal charges.
And Trump has suggested that Mueller should stick narrowly to the question of Russian meddling and maybe campaign collusion with Russian meddling in the election having to do with the DNC emails and things like that, and not look at Trump's personal finances or business finances. Do you think that's a reasonable line to draw?
No, you can't tell a prosecutor what to do, and you can't tell Mr. Mueller what to do.
And for you as a former prosecutor, does it indicate that Trump is afraid of something
Yes.
in particular?
Yes, I think his response to this, first the Comey investigation, then the Mueller investigation, attacking the prosecutors, trying to get other people to interfere. Remember, one of the things I didn't mention before is that Trump called two cabinet officials, former Senator Dan Coates and the head of the National Security Agency, Rogers, to get them to get Comey to stop an investigation. So we have a pattern that's very, very serious here of the president's trying to interfere with an investigation, and he does it in a variety of ways, and these are, and they're dangerous.
Mueller is now using two grand juries, from what's been reported, one in D.C. and one in Virginia. Why would he need two?
Well, I think one may have been started under Comey, when Comey was FBI director.
I think that's right, the one in Eastern Virginia, right?
In Eastern Virginia. And then it may be that grand jury was considering other matters, and it may also have been in Virginia, which was not as convenient as a D.C. grand jury, so that's probably why Mueller asked for the impanelment of a second grand jury. It's apparently a special grand jury, so it's just focused on this matter so that they won't have to deal with other issues, murders, bank robberies, and so forth.
Some Trump supporters like Newt Gingrich have suggested that it's too politicized to impanel it in D.C. because D.C. voted something like 96% for Hillary Clinton for president, and so finding a fair grand jury who will be fair in deciding whether or not to indict Donald Trump or his associates is hard to impossible. What do you think?
I think that's nonsense, and I think what Alan Dershowitz said is racist when he implied that—
The Harvard law professor.
He was my law professor, and I'm shocked by what he said, basically suggesting that because there were so many African Americans living in D.C. and serving therefore on grand juries that Trump couldn't get a fair grand jury. We don't think that way in America anymore. You cannot interfere with the racial composition of a jury. I mean, does that mean then that no black could be tried by a white on the jury?
Did he say racial composition, or did he just say it's a heavily
I don't know if he said racial.
area?
No, I think he talked about the composition of the jury, and I think it's true. And I think also we know what Newt Gingrich is implying by his comments too. These are, in Gingrich's case, borderline racist, and in Dershowitz's case, actually racist.
There's an old saying that a DA can indict a ham sandwich. I think it came from a former chief judge of New York State.
Who himself got into some criminal trouble.
Eventually. But the idea is that a prosecutor can, be so influential over a grand jury per se,
Correct.
that he or she can get them to do that without much trouble. How true do you think it is as a former DA?
Well, in New York, we didn't have quite the same rules that you have in the federal system. In New York, prosecutors are not allowed to make a recommendation to the grand jury. They just present the evidence and they present the law, and the grand jury has to make its determination. In the federal system, prosecutors can make a recommendation. That doesn't mean every person on the grand jury is going to agree, but most of the time the grand jury will defer to the recommendation of the prosecutor, certainly on the federal level.
Liz Holtzman, thanks for sharing your experience and insights.
Thank you.
And stay with us as we bring on some additional evidence. Time for evidence-based politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. One thing that last year's election made clear is that the loss of traditional factory jobs has transformed the political landscape, and that this is true in certain parts of the country more than others. Donald Trump capitalized on this by campaigning to revitalize the manufacturing economy. As a candidate, Trump blamed China and trade agreements, especially NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. As president, he withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement and signaled he would put a tariff on steel imports. But experts say there's another, more important factor in the loss of manufacturing jobs that's being largely overlooked. That's automation. A new study finds that half of all U.S. jobs could be at risk from automation. The study shows just how concentrated the impact is, we'll see a map, and the consequences. To walk us through these findings is Srikant Devaraj, professor of business and economics at Ball State University. His paper is called How Vulnerable Are American Communities to Automation, Trade, and Urbanization. Professor Devaraj joins us from Muncie, Indiana. Thanks for coming on. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Brian. Thanks for having me.
What did you set out to measure?
So we actually looked at the relative risk of jobs that could be lost due to automation and offshoreability at a county level. So we used two popular studies that actually finds the risk of offshoreability and automation, and we applied those with the occupational level data at a county level, and we estimated these intensity of job losses relative to one another.
So I want to put up a map that you provided showing that concentration county by county. The darker the blue or purple, the more at risk a county is from losing many jobs to automation. And oh my goodness, the dark blue is everywhere, Professor.
Unfortunately, that's the sad truth. I mean, almost all the counties are equally have a majority of their share of the jobs are under risk of automation. And based on the data, about I would say about 36 to 68% of jobs in a particular county are in a relative risk of automation with the current level of technology. Now, if the technology keeps improving, you would probably see more darker in those in the future decades.
Everybody will have to move to Montana based on that map. But your study did include a list of the top 25 counties most at risk to automation. The top 25 are all in 10 states: Alaska, Georgia, Virginia, Mississippi, the Carolinas, Alabama, Indiana, Tennessee, and Kentucky, which you could also see from that map. The jobs listed in the study are mostly surprising to me. They include data entry keepers, math jobs, telemarketers, insurance jobs. These are not the kinds of things that we consider traditional manufacturing jobs, like making cars or making clothing. These are service sector jobs and even STEM jobs, if you're talking about data entry and math. I thought these are the kinds of jobs that are supposed to be relatively immune from automation. Even they are not?
So unfortunately, no, because there are a lot of routine office jobs that are under higher risk of automation. So once an occupation is prone to many routine type activities, they are most likely to be automated. And what actually that puts into pressure is even manufacturing jobs are also under risk of automation. Even though they don't come into the top 10, they do have a major share of risk of jobs being lost to automation as well. So mostly manufacturing, logistics industry, and warehousing are three major industries that would be impacted as a result of automation. And the top automatable jobs by occupation type, that would be most likely with the routine occupations too.
I'm going to put up another graph from your study. This one shows the level of risk of a job loss to automation compared to the risk of a job being shipped out of the country by education level. And so what we see is, or by income, I should say, by income level. So the light blue line is the medium wage of people working at jobs at risk from automation. The dark blue line, which is relatively straight, is the median wage of people at risk of losing their jobs due to offshoring of the job. So as we see, the median wage of people at risk from automation is going down. So what does that tell us?
That is true. So what that graph does show is the lower levels of automation risk are indeed associated with actually much higher wages. So high wage, high skilled jobs, probably about on an average of $80,000 and above, they are actually the least automated possible jobs. And once you go past the deciles, and the lower automation jobs, automation level jobs are actually having a low wage jobs there. So the low wage, low skilled jobs are higher prone to automation than high wage, high skilled jobs. And there are, I would say, there are some, if you combine that with, say, education levels of each counties, you can look at the clustering. I mean, the hard part is the clustering of these jobs, because high wage jobs tend to be clustered together and the low wage jobs tend to be clustered together as well. So once the risk of jobs that are being lost as a result of low wages, they tend to be clustered in a mass. So that is what is concerning, especially in this kind of scenario.
Is there any policy response possible to this? Like, Trump, whether we think it would be effective or not, campaigned on policies that were meant to slow the tide of jobs going out of the country by making better trade deals, by proposing the possibility of an import tariff on products coming back here if the jobs leave, things like that. Again, those may or may not work, but they're attempts at coming up with policies designed to stop that. Are there policies that could stop the automation of the jobs of America?
Not really, because the technology actually is becoming cheaper and cheaper as we go every year, and businesses actually would like to cut down their costing because of the competitive markets, and because of these pressures, the technology is here to stay and it will always be improving. So I would like to cite a study that we did with my co-author, 2 years back. What we find is out of 100 jobs lost in manufacturing between, say, for the past 15 years, only 12 jobs were lost due to trade. And the remaining 88 jobs were actually being lost due to improvements in productivity that is predominantly from automation. Now let's look at the occupation level, and are we finding any differences in this particular levels, and how do we apply them at a county level? So that was the startling difference between the trade policies, whatever is in place. It does surely help some jobs, but we are actually overlooking the bigger picture here, which is productivity improvements. And there are some data that actually justifies our especially in the manufacturing sector. If you look at the GDP of manufacturing, say let's take 20 years back, in 1997, it's about $1,360 billion in manufacturing GDP. Now, if you take a look at 20 years later, say in 2016, the manufacturing GDP is about $1,900 billion. And these numbers are after adjusting for inflation. But during the same period in 1997, we had 17.4 million manufacturing workers. But in 2016, we have only 12.4 million workers.
So that's how big an effect automation is having.
That's a big effect.
So we just have 30 seconds. I mean, it almost sounds like an inevitable hollowing out of the middle class over time. Some people, like the former SEIU union leader, Andy Stern, say we're going to have to go to some kind of guaranteed government wage because there are going to be so few jobs in the United States. Can you give us a vision of possibilities that's less dire than that in our last 20 seconds?
So the key thing I always, when I speak with a reporter or with the media, is education is the key policy piece that actually helps people to actually retrain themselves and be adaptable to the technology change. So a high school worker a high school person getting losing a job may have a higher impact in terms of education attainment than a college worker. So the adaptability is something that needs to be done, and K through 12 should also include these kind of changes, adaptability, how they can do in their future generation.
Professor, thank you very much for sharing your study.
Thank you, Brian, for having me.
And that's POTUS 2017 for today. We're here each week at this hour pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.